Lily only wanted a candy bar, but cruelty found her first. A group of mean girls thought they could mock her without consequence, laughing at her innocence. But then, the air shifted. The store went silent. Because when Big Shaq appears, bullies don't just lose their power, they freeze. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The automatic doors of the corner store slid open with a soft hiss, and Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside, ducking slightly out of habit. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where people moved slow, dragging out conversations, savoring the golden stretch of the day. Shaq liked it here. This little convenience store, tucked between a laundromat and an old record shop. It was quiet, unassuming, a place where no one bombarded him with cameras or begged for autographs. Just a normal stop for a normal guy who happened to be 7'1" and a millionaire. He adjusted his hoodie, scanning the aisles. He didn't need anything in particular, maybe a sports drink, some beef jerky, a pack of gum. He enjoyed moments like this, blending into the hum of everyday life, where no one cared about his championship rings, or the fact that he could probably buy the entire store if he wanted. At the back of the store, near the candy section, Lily stepped inside. Lily was 23, small, with soft features and big eyes that took in the world with a kind of pure wonder. She had Down syndrome, and though the world wasn't always gentle with her, she carried a light inside her that refused to dim. She walked with purpose, heading straight for the candy aisle, where she knew her favorite chocolate bars would be waiting. She didn't notice them at first. The three girls standing near the soda coolers, their glossy hair catching the fluorescent lights. Savannah, Madison, and Chloe, the kind of girls who always moved in a pack, their presence sharp and deliberate, like wolves deciding whether or not to pounce. Savannah led the pack, her phone loosely gripped in her hand, her expensive sneakers tapping against the linoleum floor. The moment she saw Lily, her eyes sparked with cruel amusement. "Oh my God," Savannah murmured to the others, tilting her head toward Lily. The other two giggled, their gazes following hers. Lily reached for a Hershey's bar, humming softly under her breath. Savannah smirked. "Hey, that's a lot of sugar. You sure you can handle that?" Her voice was mock-sweet, laced with something uglier beneath. Lily turned, startled. Her smile faltered, but she held onto the candy bar, fingers gripping it tightly. Shaq, standing near the refrigerators, heard the shift in the air before he even turned to look. It was something he had grown up recognizing. That sharp, cutting edge of cruelty. The way it started slow, like a snake slithering before the strike. His eyes landed on the scene across the store. Lily stood small and hesitant, her body language shifting from relaxed to guarded. The girls weren't shouting, weren't making a scene. But that was the thing about real bullying. It didn't always come in loud bursts. Sometimes it came dripping in laughter, wrapped in silk, disguised as a joke. Shaq took a step forward. Savannah glanced at Madison and Chloe, barely containing her wicked grin. She took a slow step closer to Lily, lowering her voice to a mocking whisper. "Do you even know how much that costs?" she asked, tilting her head like she was talking to a small child. Lily's fingers tightened around the candy bar. "I have money," she said softly. Savannah's eyebrows lifted, feigning surprise. "Oh, my bad. I didn't know you were rich." She gave a fake gasp, nudging Madison. "Maybe she's like a secret millionaire or something." Madison and Chloe snickered, their laughter sharp and pointed. Lily shrank back, her shoulders curling inward. Shaq's jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of thing too many times. Not just when he was a kid, not just on the courts when people underestimated him, but in everyday life. The way people treated those they saw as weaker. The way power wasn't always about strength, it was about who had the upper hand in the moment. And right now, the balance was off. Another step forward. Savannah wasn't done. She turned to her friends. "Maybe we should help her count her change, just in case." More giggles, the kind that made the air feel tight, the store smaller, heavier. Shaq had enough. His presence alone was enough to shift the entire atmosphere. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, each one pulling him deeper into their space. The quiet murmur of the store faded. the soft beep of the register in the distance feeling almost too loud. Savannah felt it first, that unmistakable sense of being watched, of something much bigger standing behind her. The laughter died instantly. Slowly she turned, and there he was, Shaquille O'Neal, the big diesel himself, towering steady, unshaken. The weight of his presence was suffocating, not angry, not aggressive, just there, watching, seeing everything. Madison let out a tiny breath, her face going pale. Chloe swallowed hard, taking a small step back. But Savannah? For the first time in her privileged, untouchable life, she didn't know what to say. Shaq's gaze didn't flicker, didn't drop. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to flex his fame or power. The silence spoke louder than anything else could. Lily, still clutching her candy bar, looked up at him. Her face was a mixture of confusion and something close to relief. Shaq reached over, took a second Hershey's bar, and placed it in her hand. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, unshakable. "You got good taste." The words weren't meant for the bullies. They were meant for her. Lily blinked up at him. Savannah's face flushed, her bravado crumbling. She opened her mouth, maybe to stammer out a joke, maybe to downplay what just happened. But nothing came out. Shaq let the silence hang, unrushed, powerful in its weight. The store had changed in the last few seconds. The power had shifted. Savannah and her friends weren't the biggest presence in the room anymore, and they knew it. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and handed it to Lily. "This one's on me, superstar." The words were soft, but they echoed. The moment was sealed. Savannah, Madison, and Chloe. They just stood there, caught in the wreckage of their own cruelty, realizing too late that the world had just flipped on them, and there was nothing they could do about it. The air inside the store grew thick, as if the walls had shrunk inward, trapping everyone inside a moment too cruel to ignore. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead, their hum blending with the distant sound of the register beeping and the faint chatter of customers near the front. Yet, near the candy aisle, all of that faded into the background. Savannah tilted her head, her lips curling into a smirk as she eyed Lily still clutching her candy bar. There was something in her expression, calculated amusement, the kind that made people squirm. "So, do you even know what you're buying?" she asked, her tone mockingly sweet, like she was talking to a child. Madison let out a small snort, nudging Chloe, who barely held back a giggle. Lily fidgeted, looking at the wrapper in her hands, her fingers slightly trembling. "Of course I do," she murmured, voice soft, unsure. Savannah let out an exaggerated gasp. "Oh my God, you guys, she knows, that's impressive." She shot a glance at Madison. "Maybe she's smarter than she looks." Lily's shoulders curled inward, her confidence slowly unraveling under the weight of their words. Rachel, the cashier, froze behind the counter, gripping the edge of the register. She saw what was happening. She wanted to say something, but she hesitated, her gaze darting toward the other customers who were all pretending not to notice. A middle-aged man near the soda fridge shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking toward the scene, then quickly back to his drink, as if looking away erased his responsibility. A woman pushing a cart near the chip aisle slowed down, her lips pressing into a thin line. But she didn't stop, didn't step in. No one did, because it was easier to stay silent. Savannah leaned in closer, her voice dropping into a condescending whisper. "Do you even have money for that?" Lily flushed, gripping the candy bar tighter. "I said I have money," she repeated, but this time her voice wavered. Savannah's smile widened, sensing the crack in her confidence. "Relax," she cooed, putting a hand on her hip. "I just think it's cute how you're trying so hard." Lily's breath hitched. Shaq, who had been standing near the refrigerated section, heard every word. His back was turned, but his body tensed. He had been here before. Not in this exact store, not in this exact moment, but in this feeling. The feeling of a crowd watching, hearing, but choosing to do nothing. Savannah let out a dramatic sigh and turned to her friends. "Maybe she doesn't get it, guys. Maybe she needs like a little extra help. She took a slow step forward. Lily instinctively stepped back, her sneakers scuffing against the tile. "Oh, don't be scared," Savannah said, mocking concern dripping from every word. "We just want to be nice. Right, Maddie?" Madison, who had been laughing a second ago, suddenly hesitated. There was something about the way Lily shrunk inward that made her stomach twist. But she said nothing. Savannah, unfazed, gestured toward the candy in Lily's hands. "Come on, let's see if you can pay for it. Let's all help her count." The words hung in the air like poison. Rachel shifted behind the counter, clearing her throat. She wanted to step in. But Savannah? She was the kind of girl who didn't back down easily. She turned toward the nearest shelf and grabbed a handful of candy bars, shoving them toward Lily's chest. "Here, why don't you hold these too? Let's see how many you can count." The bars tumbled to the floor, scattering around Lily's sneakers. Lily's hands hovered in the air, uncertain, frozen. Her face burned red, her throat tightening with something she didn't want to name. Madison and Chloe laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. It was sharp, empty, cruel. Shaq's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the silent plea hanging between the laughter, the unbearable weight of the moment stretching too long. No one had moved. No one had spoken up. And then, something changed. Lily bent down, her fingers shaking as she reached for the fallen candy. It was a small thing, a tiny, human moment. And yet somehow it was the most heartbreaking thing Shaq had ever seen. Not because she had to pick up what they threw at her, but because she didn't fight back. Because she had been here before. Because she had learned that sometimes it's easier to just take it. A deep, heavy silence filled the store. And then, Shaq moved. Not fast, not aggressively, but with purpose. His towering frame cut through the aisle as he stepped forward, his shadow casting over the scene. The air shifted, a weight pressing down on Savannah and her friends before they even realized what was happening. Lily, still kneeling on the floor, felt it first. That presence, that quiet, unshakable force of something bigger than the cruelty around her. Slowly, she looked up. Savannah's smirk faltered. Madison stopped laughing. Chloe's expression turned into something uncertain, almost fearful. Shaq didn't say a word. He just stood there watching. The silence wasn't empty. It was judgment. It was power. It was a force that made the entire store feel too small, too hot, too exposed. Savannah opened her mouth, maybe to make some kind of excuse, some kind of joke to lighten the moment. But nothing came out. Because what could she say? Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. And now they were trapped in the aftermath of what they had done. Shaq finally moved, bending down. Not toward Savannah, not toward her friends, but toward Lily. He picked up one of the fallen candy bars, brushing a speck of dust from the wrapper. Then, softly, calmly, he placed it back into Lily's hands. The weight of it felt different now. Lily's fingers curled around it, her grip tighter, steadier. Shaq's voice, when it finally came, was low and firm. "You don't have to pick up anything for them." Lily blinked, the words settling deep. Savannah's breath hitched, and just like that, the power shifted. The world had turned against the bullies, and there was nothing they could do about it. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. He had been on the biggest stages in the world, faced off against the greatest athletes, stood in arenas where the pressure was enough to break even the strongest. But this moment, right here, in the middle of a small convenience store, felt heavier than any game-winning free throw or championship final. It was the way Lily hunched her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched the candy bar like it was the only thing anchoring her. It was the sharp edge in Savannah's voice, the mocking, the cruel amusement in her eyes. It was the way everyone else pretended not to hear, not to see. Shaq didn't move right away. He didn't need to. His body was tense, every muscle coiled, his hands resting at his sides but ready. The girls hadn't noticed him yet. They were too caught up in their game, too entertained by their own cruelty to realize that something was shifting. Savannah took a step closer to Lily, tilting her head, feigning curiosity. "You look nervous," she mused, her voice dripping with fake concern. "What's wrong? You were talking just fine a minute ago." Lily stared at the ground, her face burning, lips pressed tightly together. Savannah smirked, turning to her friends. She probably doesn't even know how to talk right. The laughter that followed was sharp, jagged. And then, Shaq moved. Not fast, not loud. Just one step. But it was enough. His massive frame shifted forward, his footsteps soft against the tile, yet heavier than thunder. The overhead lights cast his long shadow across the aisle, stretching until it swallowed the space where Savannah and her friends stood. The shift in the air was immediate. The store fell silent. Not just quieter, dead silent. Even the hum of the refrigerators in the background seemed to dull, the soft rustle of plastic bags at the register suddenly absent. Savannah noticed it first, the eerie change in atmosphere, the way something felt wrong, like a shift in gravity. Her smile faltered for just a second, but she forced it back, ignoring the prickle of unease at the back of her neck. She opened her mouth, ready to fire off another cruel remark. Then she turned and froze. There he was. Shaquille O'Neal. Not the laughing, playful Shaq from commercials. Not the friendly giant people begged for selfies with. This Shaq was different. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't blink. His gaze, heavy and unreadable, landed directly on Savannah. She felt it, a weight she wasn't used to. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. Madison and Chloe felt it too. They went rigid, their postures stiff, as if something in the air had shifted against them. Shaq took another step. Savannah opened her mouth, maybe to stammer out some excuse, some attempt to laugh it off. But her voice died before it could form. Shaq didn't need to say anything. His presence alone said enough. The tension in the store was suffocating, a heavy, unspoken judgment settling over everything. Savannah's throat felt dry. She had never been small before. Not in school, not in her friend group, not in any situation where she always knew how to talk her way out of things. But now she felt like she was drowning in silence. Shaq's eyes didn't flicker, didn't move away. He wasn't looking at a child acting out. He wasn't looking at some harmless teenage prank. He was seeing her, for exactly who she was. And she hated it. A slow, thick swallow worked its way down Savannah's throat. Madison shifted nervously, shooting her a glance, but there was no saving this moment. No clever joke, no quick insult could undo what had just happened. Shaq finally moved again. Not toward Savannah. Toward Lily. Bending down, he picked up one of the fallen candy bars Savannah had thrown at her earlier. The wrapper crinkled softly in his massive hand, the only sound in the store. Then, with deliberate care, he placed it back in Lily's hands. Lily blinked up at him, confusion flickering in her wide eyes. Shaq's voice, when it finally came, was low, steady, unshakable. "You got good taste." The words weren't for Savannah. They weren't for Madison or Chloe. They were for Lily, a statement, a quiet, unapologetic confirmation that she mattered, that her choice mattered. Lily's fingers curled around the chocolate, holding it tight. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Savannah's stomach twisted. The balance of power had shifted. The world had just flipped, and she had no way to fix it. The store was watching now. Rachel, the cashier, exhaled sharply, relief flooding her features. The older woman by the chips, the man by the soda fridge. They weren't looking away anymore. And suddenly, Savannah wasn't the one controlling the room. Shaq turned his gaze back to her, but it wasn't angry. It wasn't even disappointed. It was just steady. And somehow, that was worse. Savannah's throat tightened. She wanted to laugh it off. Make some joke about how this was all just messing around. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, she knew. She had messed up. Bad. The silence in the store stretched long, thick with something heavy and unspoken. It clung to the air, wrapped itself around Savannah and her friends like a rope slowly tightening. Shaq didn't move fast. He didn't need to. With the quiet ease of a man who had nothing to prove, he stepped forward until he was standing beside Lily. His presence was impossible to ignore, his shadow stretching across the floor, swallowing up the space where Savannah had once stood feeling untouchable. But now she felt small. Lily was still gripping the candy bar, her fingers trembling slightly, her knuckles pressing into the wrapper as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the moment. Without a word, Shaq bent down, his massive frame moving with a quiet gentleness that didn't match his size. He picked up another Hershey's bar, the crinkle of the wrapper the only sound in the room. Then, with a calmness that spoke louder than any outburst could, he placed it into Lily's open palm. The contrast was stark. His enormous hand, hers so small by comparison, her fingers still shaking slightly from the weight of everything that had just happened. Lily blinked up at him, confusion flickering across her face for a moment, before something else replaced it. Recognition. Relief. Like she had just found an ally in the middle of a war she didn't even know she had been fighting alone. Shaq's voice, deep and steady, broke the silence. "You got good taste." Lily's grip on the candy bar tightened. Her eyes shimmered, not quite tears, but something close. Something that had been building inside her since the second Savannah opened her mouth. And just like that, everything changed. Savannah shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Madison and Chloe as if waiting for them to say something, to laugh, to save her from this moment. But no one did. Chloe kept her eyes on the ground, suddenly fascinated with her own shoelaces. Madison crossed her arms, her jaw tight, looking at anything except Shaq. And Savannah? Savannah tried. Tried to laugh, tried to toss her hair over her shoulder like none of this mattered, like the situation wasn't crumbling around her. But when she opened her mouth, her voice, normally so sharp, so full of confidence, wavered. "I mean, we were just joking." The words felt pathetic the second they left her lips. Shaq didn't react, didn't blink, didn't soften. He just watched her, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just with a calm, steady weight that made her stomach twist. Savannah had been in control before, had controlled plenty of situations like this. But this was different. Shaq wasn't playing her game, he wasn't engaging. And somehow, that was worse than being yelled at. Because she could handle anger. She could handle someone snapping back. What she couldn't handle was being seen for exactly what she was. A girl who had thought she was powerful until someone actually powerful walked in. Shaq turned his gaze back to Lily, his posture relaxed, but his presence still unshakable. He nodded toward the register. "Come on, let's get you checked out." Lily hesitated for a second, like she couldn't quite believe that the moment was real. But then she moved. She stepped forward, and the second she did, Savannah knew it was over. She knew the moment had slipped out of her hands, that no clever comeback or empty excuse would change the way people were looking at her now. Because for once, they weren't laughing with her. They weren't looking at her with admiration or amusement. They were looking at her with something else entirely. Something that felt a whole lot like shame. Shaq and Lily made their way to the counter, moving past Savannah like she wasn't even there anymore. Rachel, the cashier, let out a small breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She scanned the candy bar quickly, her hands moving fast, almost grateful to be doing something normal again. Shaq handed her a 20. "Keep the change." Rachel nodded, sliding the bill into the register, her gaze flicking toward Savannah and her friends, who were still standing in the same spot, frozen in their own discomfort. Savannah's fingers clenched at her sides. She wanted to say something, anything, to take back control. But there was nothing left to say. The moment had already swallowed her whole. The register drawer slid shut with a soft clink, but the air in the store remained thick, unmoving. The moment should have passed. Shaq had paid. Lily had her candy. The scene should have shifted, reset, letting everyone move on as if it had never happened. But it didn't. Because Shaq still stood there. Because Savannah still felt his presence, felt the weight of something she couldn't quite define pressing down on her, making it impossible to laugh this off and walk away like she always did. For the first time in her entire life, she felt small. Not in the way she made others feel. Not in the way she had wanted Lily to feel. This was different. This was something deeper, heavier, something she wasn't used to. Shaq finally turned. His gaze landed on her, steady and unreadable. the kind of look that forced people to confront themselves whether they wanted to or not. Savannah's breath hitched. Her instincts told her to fix this, to say something quick, something sharp and sarcastic, to twist the moment back into something she could control. But when she opened her mouth, the words didn't come. They were there, stuck in her throat. But somehow for the first time they felt wrong. Madison and Chloe stood beside her, tense, waiting. For what? For her to joke, to shrug, to dismiss all of this with a careless whatever and roll her eyes? But she couldn't, because Shaq hadn't said anything yet. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't call them names or demand they apologize. He just stood there, watching them, his silence pressing heavier than any lecture could. Savannah shifted uncomfortably, hating the way her own heartbeat felt too loud in her ears. She licked her lips, forcing a shaky breath, her mind racing for something, anything to say. I mean, we were just messing around. Her voice sounded thin, weak, unfamiliar. Shaq didn't react, didn't move. His face didn't change at all. And somehow that was worse than anger. Savannah swallowed hard, shifting on her feet. She knows we were joking. She glanced at Lily, desperate for some kind of validation, some way to make this moment less suffocating. Right? Lily didn't answer. She didn't have to. Shaq exhaled slowly, the kind of deep breath that felt like a decision being made. Then finally, he spoke. You think being strong means making someone else feel weak? The words weren't loud, weren't sharp, but they landed like a weight dropped into deep water, the kind that pulled everything else down with it. Savannah's stomach twisted. The silence that followed was unbearable. For the first time, the store didn't feel like hers. She had always been good at reading people, at controlling the energy in the room, at making sure things played out in her favor. But not this time, because nothing about this moment belonged to her anymore. Shaq wasn't just some random guy stepping in where he didn't belong. He had seen her. Really seen her. Not the version she crafted, the one with the sharp edges and the easy smirks, the one people either feared or admired. He had seen through it, and for the first time, she didn't like what was underneath. Chloe shifted beside her. Madison swallowed hard, glancing down like she wished she could disappear into the floor. Shaq waited for them to feel the weight of it, to sit in the wreckage of what they had done. Savannah knew she should say something, but for the first time in her life, she didn't know what that was. The silence had settled over the store like a dense fog, thick and unmoving. It wasn't the kind of silence that came when a joke landed flat or when a conversation naturally faded. It was the kind that exposed things, the kind that forced people to sit in the wreckage of what had just happened. Savannah felt it. Madison and Chloe felt it too, their shoulders drawn in, their gazes darting anywhere but at Shaq. But Paige, standing just a few feet away, clutching a can of iced coffee, was the first to break. She hadn't spoken up earlier, hadn't said a word when Savannah and the others started mocking Lily. She had laughed along, just like always. That's how it worked. Savannah led, and everyone else followed. But now, this felt different. The air was heavier, the stakes were higher, and Paige could feel the shift happening, could see it in the way Savannah wasn't smirking anymore, in the way Shaq's words had landed like a stone in the middle of a still lake, sending ripples outward, changing everything in their path. She took a breath. It felt sharp in her chest. Then, without thinking, she took a step back. It was small, barely noticeable. But in the unspoken language of group dynamics, it said everything. She wasn't standing with Savannah anymore. She wasn't standing against her, not yet. But she wasn't beside her either. And that was enough. Savannah felt it immediately. Her head snapped toward Paige, eyes narrowing, like she could somehow will her back into place, into line, into the order of things as they had always been. But Paige didn't move, didn't look at her. Her fingers tightened around the can in her hands, her face pale, her stomach twisting. Because she knew, really knew, that this was wrong. And maybe she had always known. Maybe she had always felt that pit in her stomach when Savannah took things too far, had always ignored the uncomfortable itch in the back of her mind, when someone else was on the receiving end of their cruelty. But now there was no ignoring it. Now there was no laughing it off. Shaq had said so few words, but somehow they had rearranged the entire room. Paige felt exposed, like she was standing under a light she hadn't realized was shining before. And she hated what it was showing her. She looked at Lily, really looked at her. The way her hands still trembled slightly, the way her face was half hidden behind her hair, the way she was standing there, waiting to see if she was safe now. Paige's stomach twisted harder. She had been part of this. Not just today, every day. And she had never questioned it. But now, she couldn't stop questioning it. The shift wasn't just happening inside her, it was spreading. Rachel, the cashier, had been standing behind the counter, frozen in place, but now she found her voice. That's enough. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't a yell. But it was firm. Savannah flinched, startled by the sudden shift in power. Rachel stepped forward, planting both hands on the counter. Her expression was tight, her jaw set in a way that said she had been holding back for too long. I should have said something earlier, she admitted, her gaze flicking toward Lily, regret flashing in her eyes. I saw what was happening and I froze. I shouldn't have. Her words hit differently than Shaq's had, because Shaq was a giant, a legend, a man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms. His presence alone was enough to change the temperature of a place. But Rachel, she was just a person, a regular girl working a regular job, someone who had made a mistake in real time and was now trying to fix it. And that made it harder for Savannah to ignore. A shuffling sound came from the front of the store. A middle-aged man who had been lingering by the soda fridge stepped forward. His expression was uneasy, his face tight with something that almost looked like shame. Yeah, he muttered. I should have stepped in too. The shift was spreading. The control Savannah had once held so tightly was slipping through her fingers, faster than she could grab onto it. The customers who had been standing frozen, watching but not engaging, were now speaking up. Not against her exactly, but against what she had done, against what they had allowed to happen. Savannah felt her pulse pounding in her ears, something uncomfortable coiling in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was used to people laughing with her, following her, supporting her. But now they were turning away. Madison shifted beside her, arms still crossed, but her shoulders were tense. Even Chloe, who never questioned anything, was looking at the ground, chewing the inside of her cheek like she wasn't sure where she stood anymore. And Paige? Paige was already gone. She had taken another small step back, her entire posture different now, like she had just woken up from a dream she didn't like. Shaq's words had done something. They had unraveled the fabric of the moment, had pulled it apart thread by thread, leaving Savannah standing in the middle of something she could no longer control. She swallowed, trying to shove down the unfamiliar, sticky weight of regret that was starting to form in her chest. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to fight back, to prove she wasn't in the wrong here. But how could she, when even her own friends weren't standing with her anymore? Savannah's throat felt tight. She had always been the strongest in the room, the one people looked to, the one who set the tone. But now, Shaq was looking at her like she wasn't strong at all. And maybe, for the first time, she was starting to realize he was right. The store felt smaller now, the walls pressing in just enough to make the air feel heavier. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Savannah, who had always found a way to fill the silence, stood there trapped inside it. But Shaq felt something else entirely. For a brief second, the scene around him faded, blurring at the edges like a dream shifting into something else. Because he had been here before. Not in this store, not in this exact moment, but in the feeling of it. The feeling of being watched, being judged, being made into something he wasn't just because people wanted to put him in a box they could understand. The feeling of being too big, too different, too much. The memory pulled him back so fast, so suddenly, that for a second he wasn't standing in a store at all. He was a boy again, 12 years old. Too tall, too broad, too deep-voiced for his age. sitting in the back of a classroom that felt too small, his knees bumping against the desk, his fingers gripping a pencil so tightly it nearly snapped in half. "What's wrong with your voice?" The words had echoed in the room, loud enough to make the other kids turn. Shaq had stiffened, feeling the heat of their stares on his skin. "You sound like a grown man. Freakin' weird." Laughter. Sharp, cutting, full of something cruel that wasn't even about the words themselves. It was about the way they were said. Shaq had kept his head down, but he could feel it. The way they looked at him. The way he stood out in a way that wasn't celebrated yet. The way the teacher didn't say anything. The way the other kids just watched, waiting to see if he'd react, waiting to see if he'd give them something to laugh at. He hadn't. Not that time. Not when he was called too big to be a kid. Not when people joked about him not belonging in middle school because he looked like a high school senior. Not even when he heard the comments that weren't jokes at all, the ones whispered by parents in the stands when he started playing ball. You know how it is, his kind always get big fast. Shaq's hands had curled into fists under the desk that day, but he had never thrown a punch, not because he wasn't angry, but because he had already learned the truth about the world. If he so much as raised his voice, people wouldn't see a hurt kid. They'd see a threat. And then, one day, his mother had found him sitting on the back steps, quiet in a way that didn't feel right. Lucille O'Neill had been a woman with wisdom in her bones, and she had always known when something was wrong. She sat beside him, not pushing, not forcing him to talk. And when he finally told her, when the words finally spilled out in frustration, in confusion, in the weight of feeling like nothing he did would ever be enough, she had just listened. Then she had said, in that steady, unshakable voice of hers, "Strength is in kindness, not cruelty." Shaq had stared at her, frustrated. "But that's not how the world works, Mom." Lucille had smiled, soft, but knowing. But that's how you change it." And just like that, the memory snapped away, leaving Shaq standing back in the present, in a store that suddenly felt just like that classroom all those years ago. Savannah was still standing there, her face pale, her body tense with the weight of something she didn't know how to carry. And Shaq? He looked at her differently now, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with understanding. Because Savannah thought she was strong. She thought she was in control. But now she was just a kid realizing the world saw her differently than she wanted it to. And for the first time, she was seeing herself through someone else's eyes. For the first time, she was realizing what it felt like to be on the other side of the silence. The store hadn't changed, but the people inside it had. And Savannah felt it in her chest, heavy and unfamiliar. Because Shaq hadn't just called her out. He had made her see herself in a way she never had before. And that was the real punishment. Shaq stood still, his massive frame rooted to the floor, his presence shifting the air in a way that no one could ignore. The store had transformed. What had started as an ordinary afternoon had turned into something else entirely. Something heavier, something that no one in the room would forget. He looked at Savannah and her friends, his expression unreadable, but his gaze steady, unwavering. For the first time, Savannah didn't know where to look. Her entire life, she had been the one in control. She dictated the room, steered the energy, controlled the outcome. But now she felt like she was standing on a stage where the script had been rewritten, and she wasn't sure what role she was supposed to play anymore. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head once. Then, in that low, deliberate voice that left no room for argument, he said, "You got a choice." The words landed hard. They weren't a demand. They weren't an order. But somehow they were heavier than either of those things could ever be. Savannah swallowed, feeling the tension coil tighter in her chest. She had spent years making other people feel small, in school hallways, on social media, in moments just like this one. She had perfected the art of the sharp comment, the casual insult, the ability to make someone question their worth with nothing more than a well-placed smirk and a few words. But now she was the one shrinking. And she hated it. Paige, who had been standing beside her for years, who had laughed at all the right times, nodded at all the right moments, suddenly stepped away. It wasn't loud, It wasn't dramatic, but it meant everything. She took a slow, careful step backward, the space between her and Savannah growing wider, colder. Savannah turned her head sharply. "Paige?" Her voice had an edge to it, a silent demand, a desperate pull to bring things back to the way they had always been. Paige didn't answer right away. Instead, she let out a breath, as if she had been holding it in for too long. Then, without meeting Savannah's eyes, she said, I can't do this anymore." And just like that, it all crumbled. The foundation Savannah had built, the quiet power she had held over her group, the unspoken rules that had always kept them in place, it all fell apart in a single moment. Madison shifted uncomfortably, her arms still crossed but her face tense, uncertain. Chloe bit her lip, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweatshirt, her body half turned as if she wanted to leave but wasn't sure she had the courage. And Paige? Paige walked toward the door, the decision already made. Savannah felt something crack in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to say something sharp, something that would snap everyone back into place, remind them that she was the one who controlled how this ended. But nothing came out, because deep down, she knew. Paige wasn't the one who had changed. She was. She had never been in a moment like this before. Never been on the other end of it. Never been forced to look at herself the way Shaq was making her see herself now. Rachel, the cashier, nodded approvingly from behind the counter, as if she had been waiting for this shift to happen. Something had just changed in the store, something that no one could take back. Savannah felt raw, exposed in a way she never had before. She wanted to leave, wanted to disappear before anyone else could say anything. But then, she made the mistake of looking at Lily, and that's when she felt it, the weight of it, the full realization of what she had done. Lily wasn't angry. She wasn't standing there with that look people get when they want revenge. She was just watching Savannah like she was trying to understand her, trying to figure out why she had chosen to be this person in the first place. Savannah's throat tightened, because for the first time she wasn't looking at Lily as a target, as an easy joke, as someone to push down so she could feel taller. She was looking at her as a person she had hurt for no reason, a person she had taken something from just because she could. And suddenly she wasn't sure if she could live with that. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to apologize, wanted to say something, anything, to make this moment feel less like a spotlight exposing her for who she really was. But what could she say? Sorry? That felt small, empty, not enough. She opened her mouth, then closed it, because she didn't have the words. And maybe, for the first time in her life, that was a good thing. Shaq watched her, his expression still unreadable, still waiting to see what she would do. Savannah licked her lips, then took a shaky breath. She turned to Madison and Chloe. "Let's go." It wasn't a command, not this time, and for once neither of them jumped to follow her. Madison hesitated, then walked toward the door on her own. Chloe glanced at Lily one last time, guilt flickering across her face before she hurried after them. Savannah turned toward Shaq, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She expected him to look at her like she was nothing, but he didn't. He just nodded, like he saw something in her she didn't see in herself yet. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the store, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. She didn't know what came next, didn't know if she could fix what she had done. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't walking away the same person who had walked in. The automatic doors slid shut behind Savannah and her friends, the sound barely noticeable over the lingering weight in the air. It was strange, how something so loud, so sharp could end in silence. For the first time since this all began, the store felt still. No laughter, no whispers, no cruel smirks hiding behind fake innocence. Just a quiet that wasn't empty, but full. Shaq stood beside Lily, his towering frame still commanding the space, but his presence had softened. The tension that had settled deep into his muscles finally began to ease, the weight of the moment lifting, even if just slightly. He turned his head, looking down at Lily. She was still holding the candy bar, the same one she had been gripping so tightly before. But now, Her hands weren't shaking anymore. With the same easy calm he had always carried, Shaq reached out and gently patted her shoulder, a reassuring touch that didn't need words. Then, without urgency, he gestured toward the counter. "Come on. Let's get you checked out." Lily hesitated for just a second, as if she was waiting for something else to happen. But when she glanced around and saw that the moment had truly settled, that there was no one left to hurt her, she exhaled. It was a small breath, but it carried the weight of every unsaid word, every moment she had stood in silence when she shouldn't have had to. She walked with Shaq to the register, each step feeling a little lighter than before. Behind the counter, Rachel straightened, her face still holding traces of regret. She had been quiet for too long, had let herself freeze when she should have spoken up. But now, she offered Lily a small smile. "That'll be $1.50. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out a $20 bill. He placed it on the counter, his massive hand nearly covering the entire bill. "Keep the change." Rachel looked at the money, then back at Shaq, understanding that this was more than just a transaction. She nodded. "Got it." As Lily took her candy, she turned to Shaq, still holding it carefully, as if it meant more now than it had before. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a voice that was soft but unwavering, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 words, not loud, not dramatic, but somehow stronger than any scream could have been. Shaq's face, so serious moments ago, shifted into a grin, the familiar warmth returning, the kind of smile that had always felt like home to the people who knew him best. He nudged her playfully. "Anytime, superstar." Lily smiled back, and for the first time since she had walked into this store, it felt real. The moment lingered, stretching into something bigger than the space they stood in. Because this was more than just a lesson for Savannah and her friends. This was a reminder that the world wasn't always kind, that some people would always try to tear others down just because they could. But strength? Real strength wasn't in being louder, in being cruel, in making people feel small. Sometimes the strongest voices were the ones that didn't need to yell. The world doesn't change with loud words. It changes in small moments where someone chooses to stand up instead of staying silent. Next time you see cruelty disguised as laughter, ask yourself, will you be part of the silence, or will you be the shift that stops it? Because real strength isn't in tearing others down, it's in lifting them up.